I want to give a quick summary about my research. And as you have recognized, I'm a finance faculty. So I approach the topic of corporate sustainability from a finance perspective. So why am I interested, or how did I get interested in this topic? When I was still a student studying economics, I read, writings by, for example, Adam Smith, who said, there is an invisible hand in the market, which harnesses the corporation's pursuit for their self-interest to the pursuit of efficiency. So in other words, Adam Smith, the inventor of economics, that if every company just maximize their own profits, then the whole society, the economy will reach the optimal level. And I also read another famous economist, Nobel laureate Milton Friedman, in a New York Times article titled "The Social Responsibility of Business is to Increase its Profits." So Friedman argued that only people have responsibilities, business does not have responsibilities, and managers would be spending someone else's money for general social interest. If he does, he is in effect imposing taxes. So doing CSR is basically managers doing good with other people's money, and manager in this case are basically taxing other people. So shareholders, customers, employees, they could separately spend their own money on the particular action if they wish to. Therefore, the company's responsibility is to make as much money as possible and give the money to shareholders, employees, etc. And if they want to do their social responsibility, just do it on themselves. So this is what economic theories predicts, which leaves very little room for CSR, sustainability practice. And this is very different from what we observe in the real world. So in the real world, we see CSRs increasingly becoming a mainstream activity, and almost all major companies, they publish CSR reports. They have a CSR section on their website. So I began to think about how to reconcile, what's predicted by economic theory and what we observe in the real world. Why there is this discrepancy? But of course, a simple answer would be economic theories are wrong. And I think very often my colleagues, at least when I was doing my PhD, my colleagues from other fields usually told me, you guys in finance always think in a very narrow-minded way, that you think everything is about money. But I think the answer probably is not that easy. There are much more nuances on that. So I began to think about the connection between sustainability and finance. So in the next few minutes, I would like to offer kind of a finance researcher's perspective. So for me, I consider this as, or the corporate sustainability as three pillars. The first pillar is that this is a governance issue because it concerns the trade-off between shareholders and other stakeholders. So in finance, governance is fundamentally shaped by corporate law, not only corporate law, but also contract law, security law, all kinds of legal frameworks. And governance also means CSR should entail agency angle. There may be a scope for agency problem. Actually, some financial economists do argue that doing CSR is like managers spending other people's money for his or her own reputation. So this is indeed a reflection of. The second pillar is I think sustainability practice is about long-term orientation or long-term investment. So if this is about long-term orientation, then that has something to do with corporate culture, corporate cognition, or cognitive bias, which can be shaped by many factors, including the language people speak. And I will shortly talk about one of the research related to linguistic characteristics. It will also crucially depends on the financing of long-term projects. For example, many environmental R&D projects, they require long-term capital, whereas the stock market may be too short-term oriented, so they may rely on other source of financing. The third pillar is about not only CSR is not only motivated by the firm's own decision, but it can also be affected by other firms. So in other words, there is a spillover effect among firms. And in my own research, I try to understand this spillover effect through the competitive relationship between firms on the product market, as well as through supply chain. So how customers and suppliers, they can influence each other. So driven by these three pillars, or so-called the finance perspective of corporate sustainability, I published some papers along these lines. Under the first pillar, I had two papers. On the foundations of corporate social responsibility, we published at JF in 2017, and socially responsible firms at JFE 1 year earlier. Later on, I will shortly describe what we find, what we try to argue in these papers. We studied the effect of language on corporate future orientation, and this was published 2 years ago at Organization Science. And then second paper, we are currently doing an R&R at Management Science that's called LaViensen Inc. and Corporate Environmental Engagement, in which we look at the role of state ownership in driving corporate environmental performance. And under the third pillar, I have two papers as well. One is called Peer Effects of CSR, which was last year published at Management Science, in which we study how CSR can spill over across product market peers or rivals. And the second paper, we look at how CSR can spill over between customers and suppliers. So that's socially responsible corporate customers published this year at JFE. Now, let me briefly tell you what we do in these papers. So under the first pillar, on the governance perspective, the paper with Luke, we argue and find that a firm's CSR rating, using many CSR ratings that's probably you are aware of, such as MSCI, Thomson Reuters, Sustainalytics, etc. These ratings are highly correlated with a country's legal origin. A legal origin is a stronger explanation than many other well-documented factors, such as doing good by doing well, in other words, corporate profitability, and firm and country level characteristics such as ownership, globalization, economic development, etc. We find that firms from common law countries, which based on the law and the finance theory, is supposed to have a more of a shareholder orientation. They have lower CSR than companies from civil law countries, which put more focus on stakeholders oriented system, with Scandinavian civil law firms having the highest CSR ratings. So our argument here is that because common law provides better shareholder protection, more investor orientation, this leaves relatively little room for protecting other stakeholders' interests. And to establish causality, we also use several scandals related to CSR as well as nature disasters. For example, we look at Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami, Chinese milk powder scandal, spill, and we see how companies from different legal systems, from common law and civil law systems, react to these shocks differentially. In the other paper with Luke and Alan Farrow at Harvard, we better governed firms, so firms with better corporate governance also tend to have higher ESG ratings. The way we measure corporate governance is by constructing several firm level and country level indicators for the severity of agency problem, or in other words, the quality of corporate governance. And the fact that we found a positive correlation between governance and CSR indicates or refutes the prevalent view in finance that CSR is motivated by agency problem. In other words, managers are basically doing good with other people's money. We are saying although managers are doing good with other people's money, they are ultimately benefiting other people, namely shareholders. Under the second pillar, about long-term orientation, so in a paper at Organization Science with Luke, Chris, and Sunny, we develop a future time framing perspective, which is rooted in organizational categorization and organizational framing. And we find that firms, companies, with their working language that can postulatively separate the future tense and the present tense, such as English and French. When you speak those languages, you have to use a future tense to describe the future. Those firms, they engage less in future-oriented behaviors. We measure future-oriented behaviors as CSR, R&D spending, and patenting activities. So why this is the case? we argue that if a language compulsorily separates the future tense and the present tense, this kind of language is called a strong future time reference language. This forces the speakers to separate the future and the present in different categories in their minds. So when they talk about future today, they feel future is in a different category, which is far away from the speaker. So the speaker will care less about the future. So the speaker's behavior will be less future-oriented. This is borrowed from some linguistics literature, especially the so-called Shapiro-Whorf hypothesis, which argues that the way people speak can also shape the way people think. Also under this long-term orientation category, we are studying how government ownership, state ownership in publicly listed companies can shape the company's environmental practice. And we find government-controlled firms typically have better environmental performance, engage more in environmental issues than their private counterparts. So our key story here is that state ownership is better at securing long-term financing than private ownership, which has to rely on banks, credit markets, stock markets, and sometimes those financial markets can be short-term oriented, and they may face financial constraints of raising those money. And for CSR environmental investment, this require long-term capital commitment, and the government plays an important role in this case. Government or state ownership relative to regulations and laws for the government to deal with externalities problems. Under the third category or third pillar, we study the spillover of sustainability practice. So in my management science paper, we argue that if CSR has strategic value, it will bring a competitive advantage to a firm and will also create a competitive threat to its peers, to its rivals. So the way we test this is to use a regression discontinuity framework, which is similar to Caroline's management science paper, in which she looks at a firm's CSR proposal during the shareholder meeting. These are so-called closed call proposals because some proposals got marginally passed, other proposals got marginally failed. We also look at this closed call proposal setting, but we look at the voting firm's rival company's reaction. What we find is that if a company passes a closed call CSR proposal, this will trigger a negative stock market reaction on its rival firms. And what the rival firms will do, the rival firms in the following year will adopt similar CSR practice so as to catch up with the voting firm. So this confirms that if you adopt the CSR strategy, CSR practice, then this is a competitive advantage. Your own stock price will improve. This is what Caroline found in her paper, and we validate these results in our paper as well. But this is also a threat to your competitors. So your competitor will experience stock market drop, and they will try to catch up by doing a similar type of CSR and to regain their competitive advantage. And finally, in my JFE paper on supply chain, we find a unilateral effect on CSR from the customers to the suppliers, rather than from suppliers to customers along the global supply chain. We argue that customers can exert influence on the supplier's CSR through two main channels. One is positive associative matching. That means if I'm a high CSR customer, I will find. Finally, we find that the CSR efforts can help improve the operational efficiency and firm valuation of both the suppliers. So both customers and suppliers, they benefit from the collective CSR efforts. I have a few ongoing research projects, but for the sake of time, I'm not going for them in details, but I try to look at the individual or sub-dimensions of CSR, such as employees' welfare, corporate donations, especially disaster relief, as a form of disaster relief giving. I look at microfinance, interest rates for financial inclusion. I look at hedge funds, which are PRI signatories. And currently, I'm also writing a case study on the business model innovation in dealing with issues in Africa. Okay, so despite the technical problem, I think I finished all my presentation.